Good morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you also very much for joining us today. We have launched our annual year-end giving campaign that will continue through December. As a small nonprofit, we depend upon the support of our viewers to raise money to cover our operations and the production of these live streams. So please stay tuned at the end of this live stream to find out how you can contribute. My staff and I greatly appreciate your support. For those of you who would like to submit questions to Dan, I think you know the drill. The control panel on the right-hand side of the screen, just type in your questions and Jessica will be managing them in about 20 or 25 minutes. It's now my pleasure to introduce politics professor Dan Schnur, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Dan has three terrific topics for us today: the transition update with Biden, Trump, and COVID. Second, how the rest of the world views our elections. And third, California election overview, how the Golden State voted. Dan, we can't wait. Please take it away.
Thanks so much, Kim. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. As always, we're really grateful for your interest and your involvement and your support. Lots to talk about today, as usual. But while this transition is many things, it is certainly not a typical one. And while there hasn't been all that much that's been typical about the Trump presidency from its very beginning, that its endgame, now several weeks away, is not proceeding according to traditional norms any more than much else about his time in office. So what's going on with the transition? Now, Joe Biden is proceeding as best he can without the official designation and therefore the more official assistance that a president-elect normally receives from an outgoing administration. And the president, of course, is still resisting what appears to be an increasingly inevitable outcome. So Biden first. The president-elect announced his White House chief of staff and several senior White House staff members and advisors. It looks as though he'll begin announcing his cabinet over the next few weeks. And at least so far, given those initial appointments, we've heard some grumbling from the party's progressive wing, but not all that much yet. But when we move from staff positions to cabinet, expect the feedback from all factions in the party to start getting louder. And of course, what the president-elect is trying to do is getting the nation to focus on the growing menace of the coronavirus pandemic. And of course, as all of you know, the caseload almost everywhere in the country now is not growing at its largest rate since spring, and in many places even to a greater degree than we saw when the menace first appeared last March and April. Now let's talk about Trump for a moment first before we go on. And as we discussed last week, he's essentially doing three things. Number one, he's making noise. He's tweeting, and his surrogates are talking about why the election outcome is either unjust or inaccurate. And the speculation continues to be that he is looking to lay groundwork for a potential 2024 campaign. Alternatively, that he may be interested in either in purchasing or associating himself with an existing or new conservative television cable network or website. And whichever direction he goes in, his primary goal at this point appears to be to keep his supporters as loyal and as motivated as possible. And this is a dynamic that's gone through both of his presidential campaigns and his presidency. Ultimately, his base is so steadfast in their devotion to him that Trump's top priority for the last 5 years has been keeping them as stoked up as and excited as possible. So number one, he's making noise. Number two, he and his lawyers are still contesting results in several key states, and those outcomes are looking more and more dubious for the president and his team as every day passes. We'll talk more going forward about why that legal process is still continuing, even given the very, very small likelihood that it does succeed. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. And third, of course, the president is still taking substantive steps on any number of fronts, and many of them will complicate things for his successor, and we'll come back to that in just a moment too. But before we do, I want to bring all of you into the conversation. So Claire, if you can put up the first question. I'm asking you, when do you think Donald Trump will permit the Biden transition to officially begin? In the next week or so? After the states certify the election results on December 8th? After the Electoral College meets? Or excuse me, then that's a bit inaccurate. That's my fault. The third option should actually say after the states officially designate the electors on December 14th, after the Georgia runoff elections on January 5th, or will he not allow the transition to begin in an official way? And Joe Biden will take office at noon on January 20th without benefit of access to the government in advance of his swearing in, the way 45 other presidents have had. Last week, I asked you whether you thought the president would concede or not. And more than 3/4 of you said that he would never concede. So let's see what you think on this question. When do you think he will allow things to move forward? In the next week or so? We've got a couple of optimists, but only a couple. After the states certify election results on December 10th, that's 10%. After the electors are designated, 35%. That's a pretty sizable number. After the Georgia runoff elections on January 5th, 13%. And that's a more complicated option for reasons we'll talk about a little bit later today and much more after Thanksgiving. And 41% say never, that President-elect Biden will become President Biden without the official assistance of the Trump administration until he actually takes office. But let's talk a little bit more about what's going on in this transition. Two important news stories that ran this morning that I'd like to point out to all of you that if you haven't seen, I'd really direct your attention. Number one, CNN is reporting. Excuse me, let me go back. I'll come back to CNN in a second. First of all, the Washington Post is reporting the new Trump strategy based on these legal challenges. And what the Post reported this morning is that the president and Rudy Giuliani and the rest of his legal team have increasingly come to terms with the fact that most of these challenges are not going to succeed. Perhaps none of them will. But what the Post story says is that the reason they're continuing is that even though Trump understands that the legal challenges will not succeed and election results will not be overturned, he now believes that the longer he can keep the outcome uncertain in the minds of his supporters, the more likely they are to stay motivated on his behalf, not just in the immediate, but in the long term. So it's an interesting, from a practical standpoint, it's not much of a shift, but it's an interesting insight into how the president and the people around him are thinking. They seem to understand now that these challenges aren't going to work, but the longer they can keep their supporters excited at the possibility, the more likely those supporters are to remain in the Trump camp and enthused on his behalf over the long term through a Biden presidency for whatever comes next for Donald Trump. Second story, of much more substantive import, is CNN, as I began to tell you a moment ago. CNN is reporting that in addition to what President-elect Biden is doing publicly, which is being fairly measured in his comments about Trump's recalcitrance, apparently the Biden team has employed low-key but increasingly forceful pressure on Republican elected officials in Washington and elsewhere. And they've employed former colleagues of those electeds, former members of Congress and former governors to pressure Republican House and Senate members. They've reached out to Republican donors and to traditionally Republican allies in the business community, all to begin to raise the pressure on Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy and other Republicans on Capitol Hill. We've seen just in the last couple of days that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, and Trump allies on Wall Street like Jamie Dimon and Steven Schwartzman all talking about how the election is over and has been decided. And apparently that's something that to a large degree is being orchestrated by the Biden transition, attempting to raise the pressure on the Republican Party leaders without putting them in a position where they become too publicly at odds with the president. CNN also reported that they are doing, they've begun outreach and begun having conversations with members of the Trump administration about the transition. Trump administration officials, appointed officials, who, despite the president's order, are beginning to have quiet conversations with the Biden campaign in order to prepare them, the Biden transition. And CNN also reports that the Biden people have been conducting considerable outreach to Trump administration alumni. In the Defense Department, former Defense Secretary Mattis's team is apparently in conversation with the Biden transition, and several other alums of the Trump administration are talking to Biden's people as well. And while that's obviously not a substitute for the type of more official transition that ought to be taking place by now, it's clear that despite Joe Biden himself's relatively low-key conversation about this, that they're not just sitting around and waiting. And in fact, even if it is unofficial, the transition's begun in any number of ways. So back to Trump. Like I said earlier, let's put aside the legal challenges and the tweets for now, and let's talk about the substantive action that he's taking. So, of course, the president fired his defense secretary and several other top appointees at the Department of Defense, replacing them with people he believes will be more loyal to him. As a result, he was able to move forward with reducing dramatic reductions in troop levels in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's been reported that he was seriously considering a military strike in Iran until talked out of it by advisors who recognized the broader implications of such an airstrike. The administration is moving ahead on a panoply of reducing regulations on oil drilling and on logging, types of things that will have the environmental community in very high dudgeon. And of course, as the pandemic continues to rage and as the threat continues to grow, the administration is doing fairly little on that front, although it is worth noting that the CDC did officially say this morning that they were advising Americans not to travel for Thanksgiving. And we'll see in the next few hours how the president responds to that offer from the Center for Disease Control. Now, we talked about this a little bit last week, and I understand that many of you may have questions about this. But what happens between now and January 20th if the president takes actions that are not just matters of disagreement in terms of public policy, but attempts actions that could potentially threaten the transfer of power rather than simply delaying it? And like I told you last week, and I'll emphasize this even more today than I did last Thursday, keep an eye on General Mark Milley. General Milley is the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he's really the key player in this. If Trump were to take action that really did threaten the transfer of power, the role that this general plays is key. And there is increased evidence that he is beginning to very, very quietly and very, very subtly establish the fact that he will not necessarily go along with that. Just one small example, when Trump announced his new Secretary of Defense last week, Milley wasn't there. And the fact that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was not at an announcement of the new Secretary of Defense is very unusual and very notable. Second, as you may remember, General Milley promised Congress back in August that the military would play no role, his words, not mine, no role in post-election disputes. And for those of you who might not have seen it, last week General Milley gave a very widely covered Veterans Day speech to U.S. troops. And he said the following, quote, "We are unique among militaries. We do not take oath to a king, a queen, a tyrant, or a dictator. We do not take oath to an individual. We take oath to the Constitution," unquote. And many military experts interpreted Milley's speech and that excerpt from it as a way of letting the relevant players know that if the president did attempt to in some way thwart an official transition, that Milley would not be part of it and would do everything he could to keep the military from being part of it as well. So let's move on to our second question. That one took a while, but obviously a lot going on in the transition. And what I'd like to do is broaden that topic a little bit. So we're not just talking about what the rest of the world sees in our election and transition, which is growing concern and in some countries alarm, but talk a little bit, and we'll discuss this much more in the weeks ahead following Thanksgiving, is let's begin a conversation we'll be having between now and Inauguration Day about the Biden administration and their foreign policy. So the first challenge President Biden will face is navigating through what Trump has left him. And I just talked a moment ago about several of the actions that the president is taking in the final weeks of his administration that in many ways look like they may complicate life for his successor. And in fact, once again, another CNN report reported that an administration official told a CNN reporter that the president's goal is to set so many fires that it'll be hard for the Biden administration to put them all out. In other words, what President Trump is trying to do is to make things as difficult for Biden as possible, according to this unnamed official, in order to potentially increase the likelihood of a 2024 rematch. And what is the administration doing? We mentioned removing troops from Afghanistan and Iraq. They're contemplating new terrorist designations in Yemen that could complicate efforts to broker peace in that country. Pushing fairly large-scale arms sales to the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain in a way that could alter the balance of power in the Middle East. It's been reported they're planning a last-minute crackdown on China and apparently building a veritable wall of sanctions to make it much more difficult for President Biden to rejoin the Iran nuclear agreements that Biden has indicated he would like to rejoin. Now, reasonable people can disagree on the policy implications of some of those actions, but it's very clear that those actions will make it more difficult, at least in the first months of the Biden administration, for the new president to move toward his foreign policy goals. Now, again, much longer conversation to be had in the months ahead. But before we go on with Trump and foreign policy right now, I'd like to ask you then our next question from our polling. And so, Claire, thank you very much. How would you assess the long-term impact of Trump's foreign policy? What I've been talking about is, of course, what he's done in recent weeks. But if you think back over the last 4 years, how would you assess the impact for Trump's foreign policy going forward? Significant benefits? Slight benefits? No big change for the good or the bad? Negative impact that his successor, that Joe Biden, can repair? Or major impact with more lasting damage? Claire, let's see what everybody has to say. I'll look at that. 4% say benefits of some type or other. 0, not a single person out of our several hundred participants say no big change. I think that's a safe bet. But look at that, 95% say that the changes were negative, but there's almost an even split on whether you believe that those changes are repairable or whether there's more lasting damage. And although I'm beginning to sound like a broken record, that'll be the topics of conversations that we have after Thanksgiving through the end of the year, all the way up until the inauguration and beyond. All sorts of differences between the two men looking forward. Biden will almost certainly be tougher on Russia. He's already indicated he wants to rejoin the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Treaty. North Korea is already very wary of the Biden administration because they think that Biden will be tougher to deal with than Trump has been. Biden's relationship with Israel, I think, by and large, will be a good one, but certainly challenges are there, obstacles are there if Biden does attempt to return to the Iran nuclear agreement. Not that different on China, at least not in action, but much more different in language. And one of the things you'll see going forward in the Pacific Rim, in Europe and around the world as well, is Biden is an avowed multilateralist. And while Donald Trump believed that on trade and on other issues, he believed in bilateral one-on-one conversations and negotiations with other world leaders, Biden believes that the much more effective way of achieving geopolitical policy goals is through multinational coalitions. So again, Biden's approach on China, on trade, on human rights, on security and military issues won't be all that different than Trump's in substance. but you'll see him working a lot more with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, with India, and with European countries whose interests in China have been growing very rapidly. Let's talk for one more minute about the Pacific Rim and about the challenge that Biden will be taking on there once he takes office. Because I'm going to give you an example of how a bilateral rather than a multilateral approach has impacted our standing in that part of the world. So this week, for the third year in a row, the president declined to participate in the annual summit of an organization called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And that's a meeting that includes the leaders, the presidents, the prime ministers, and so forth, of 10 member nations in the United States, which belongs as an ex officio member. The president did not attend the East Asia Summit as well, a similar gathering. But this year, for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, not only did Trump not attend, not only did Mike Pence not attend, but no cabinet level official participated in either of those events. Now, obviously, in the time of COVID, those meetings didn't take place in person. It wasn't a matter of flying halfway around the world. But no cabinet level official from the Trump administration participated even by remote, by video. And I will tell you that from what I've read, that a snub like that wasn't just a missed opportunity to shore up relations with countries the United States needs to work with on security and trade and public health issues. It also left a vacuum that Beijing was more than happy to fill. And what the China's leaders did is they signed a trade agreement with 14 other Asian countries this past weekend. It's known as the Regional Economic Comprehensive Partnership. And it's not just about trade. It's about whether countries facing intense pressure from Beijing believe the United States is a credible alternative partner on any matter. Its substance and its symbolism, and the message that this administration has been sending to our allies on the Pacific Rim is that China might be a more reliable partner. And Biden will obviously work very hard to reverse that approach. But I think you get a sense of the challenge going forward. So I've been emphasizing the Pacific Rim, but quite a bit going on around the world as well, in other parts of the world as well. So Claire, maybe we can put up our third question and let our group decide which of these challenges we should be focusing on in the weeks ahead. And maybe this should be one of our topics, not next week, because next week is Thanksgiving Day, of course, but the following week. So what do you think will be Biden's biggest foreign policy challenge? Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it North Korea? The Middle East and Africa? Or is it Latin America? You tell us. And Jessica, Claire, maybe we can make sure this is one of our topics when we do come back from the Thanksgiving holiday. What does everyone have to say, Claire? That 78% say China. So my instinct was right. So let's agree that when we do come back from Thanksgiving, we'll do a deep dig on China. But rest assured that in the weeks ahead, we will talk about Russia, about North Korea, about the Middle East and Africa, and about Latin America as we move forward to the inauguration. Let's talk for a few minutes, and then of course I'm eager to open it up to your questions. Let's talk about California, because that was something we were going to do last week and we ran out of time. So I'd like to spend a few minutes at least talking about California's elections. And while there were, and still are, some very interesting congressional races going on, the big ticket in California, as always, is our ballot initiatives. The Proposition 15 initiative, which would have changed property tax protections for commercial enterprises, was just barely defeated. Proposition 16, which would have reinstilled racial preferences and affirmative action in government hiring and college admissions, was defeated by a very large margin. And Proposition 22, which will allow Uber and Lyft to classify their workers as contractors rather than as full-time employees, passed as well, with a lot of money spent behind it. All right, there were initiatives in addition on criminal justice, on rent control, on privacy, even on dialysis machines. But let's find out from you what we should spend our last few minutes of this portion of the conversation on. Which of these initiatives was most interesting to you in terms of outcome? And I recognize that we have some participants from outside of California, but hopefully you'll find the issues underneath the initiatives interesting, even if you didn't have a chance to participate in the vote itself. So what was most important to you? Was it Prop 15 and property taxes? Was it Proposition 16 and affirmative actions? Was it Proposition 22, the way classifications for Uber and Lyft and other gig workers may change? Was it Proposition 23, standards for dialysis clinics? And I'll admit I'm not all that well educated on that one. And Proposition 25, replacing cash bail. 5 out of several fascinating initiatives. Which one's most interesting to all of you? 50%, not even close. 50% said Proposition 15, which would have changed the way California's landmark Prop 13 would have been implemented, is most interesting, fully half, while Prop 16, 22, and 25 get a good share. And the fact that there are 3% out of you who pick dialysis clinic standards, I promise we can have that conversation at some point in the future, but I'm gonna have to prepare better for it. So let's talk for a couple minutes about Prop 15. So in 1978, as most, if not all of you know, California voters passed Proposition 13, which put very strict limits on property tax increases. Now, critics of Proposition 13 felt that that deprived local government of necessary funding because property taxes go to local government, and has had a very adverse impact on the abilities of local government in California to fund necessary services. And over the years, opponents of Proposition 13 have talked about how to repeal it or to reform it in order to provide more revenue for what they would argue are necessary government services that aren't getting the funding that they deserve. So for years, they talked about a split roll. And the idea was because Californians feel so strongly about their homes and not paying overly high property taxes on their residences, the thought was instead, rather than trying to raise property taxes on people's homes, on residential property, to concentrate only on commercial property. And that became known as a split roll, because you'd protect taxes on residences, but not on commercial businesses. And over the years, the opponents of Prop 13 came to realize that even a split roll that only raised taxes on business but not on residential homes would probably not meet the approval of a majority of California voters. So this year they came up with what we'll call a split roll, that it wouldn't have just raised property taxes on all businesses, but only those businesses that were valued at more than $3 million a year. And the argument was, these are big businesses, they're very successful, they're very lucrative. Let's ask them to pay more of their property tax revenue to fund these government services. The opponents of Proposition 15 made essentially two arguments against the initiative. They said that even if you raise property taxes just on large commercial enterprises, it's going to hurt a lot of small businesses and their customers too. And the example they gave is if Jessica or Claire owned a very large-scale commercial property, they might be fabulously wealthy, but their tenants, the dry cleaners, the coffee shops, the yoga studios, they would have that property tax increase passed on to them, and it would make it much more difficult for those smaller businesses to survive and could result in higher prices for customers as well. And that was a very effective argument against the initiative. The even more effective argument was that the opponents of Prop 15 said to the voters, well, they're concentrating on large businesses now, but if they pass this initiative, they're going to try to raise property taxes on residential properties on your home next. And California voters, particularly homeowners who very, very greatly value their homes and residences, were worried that this might be the first step towards something more menacing, and voted against the initiative by a very, very small margin. So we can talk more about that in the next half an hour if you like. We can go back to talking about Joe Biden and foreign policy. We can go back to talking about the transition. We can talk about whatever you want. Or more specifically, we can talk about whatever Jessica Duganzik wants, because now that she's going to join me again, she gets to decide which of the questions you're sending in are the ones that we'll have a chance to discuss between now and 12 noon. So Jessica, if you're willing to come back.
Sure. Thank you so much. I had to run to the window because there was a loud truck beeping and going backwards. So if I look a little frazzled, just trying to maintain that audio quality.
You do not look frazzled at all. So where should we start?
Great. Thank you. First question, does Biden have any leverage to compel Trump to authorize Biden to receive national security briefings and/or have his people receive information regarding the plans for dealing with COVID virus, both for disseminating the vaccine and coordinating treatment efforts?
Okay, the two really good questions. There's been some speculation that the Biden transition might file a lawsuit against the Trump administration, demanding that the transition begin officially, to not only allow him to receive those briefings, but for his team to begin getting more up to speed on COVID, on national security, and on other issues. And while it's definitely not off the table, it appears that the president-elect has decided that pursuing that through legal means, through a lawsuit, is not something he wants to do. One, he worries it would take too long to be relevant. But second, he just doesn't think it will be all that useful. And as I mentioned earlier, Biden and his team have decided, number one, to do the best they can without that official information. He's not meeting with the Secretary of Defense, in other words, but he's meeting with the former Secretary of Defense and staff. He might not be meeting with the individuals who are currently working on COVID, but he's meeting with people who worked in the Trump administration on these issues and other issues very recently. So that's one tactic. And then the other, as I mentioned earlier, is looking to find ways to scale up the pressure on Trump's Republican allies, because Biden believes that if they begin to push back in a more forceful way, that Trump will have much less, fewer options except to accede. Now, as we asked in the poll question, whether that happens after the election results are certified, and the state of Georgia will be the first to officially certify its results tomorrow, and every state will have acted by December, is required to have acted by December 8th. Will it be then? Will it be on December 14th when the electors are first named? Or, as we asked about in the poll, will it be on January 6th, the day after the runoff election in Georgia? Because it is worth noting that in particular, Senator McConnell, even more than the House leadership, that Senator McConnell and the other Republican senators, of course, very badly want to maintain their majority in the Senate. And their concern is, it's been reported, is that if they pressure Trump to officially concede the election and to allow the transition to begin, that could deflate the enthusiasm of Republican voters to turn out for the two GOP candidates down there, David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler. A runoff election, like a special election, involves almost no persuasion at all, because there aren't that many undecided voters after an election like the one we had a few weeks ago. So what we're seeing in Georgia is a pure exercise in base motivation. And Republican senators are concerned that in order to get their base to turn out, given at least some of those Georgia Republicans who are loyal to the president, the hope that this might still not go in the other direction is worth keeping as a possibility in their heads to get them to vote on Election Day. Now, January 6th, of course, is only 2 weeks before the inaugural. That doesn't leave much time for a transition, which is why these unofficial outreach efforts are so important. But Biden's really if he does not pursue a legal strategy, public and private pressure are his two best options. And of course, then he's employing both of those right now.
Thank you. Given the new wave of the virus nationally, do you see any new action on the stimulus bill before Biden is sworn in? Or will it be January or longer before help arrives?
I worry that it's unlikely. Senator McConnell, as we talked about last week, has indicated that he does want a COVID relief package to pass, albeit one that's much smaller than the one that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are calling for. And even if McConnell's opening offer is not as large as the Democratic congressional leaders would like, you would think that would lead to at least the beginning of more serious negotiations. It hasn't. And I suspect the reason it hasn't is widespread uncertainty among both Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill, that even if they do come to an agreement that isn't either side's first choice, they have no idea what President Trump's reaction would be to that, whether he would sign or veto such an agreement. So I hope I'm wrong. I'm hoping that the December 10th deadline to simply come to an agreement to keep the government open rather than going through another government shutdown could provide an impetus to move forward, particularly once election results are certified. but I worry this is something that might wait until President Biden has been sworn into office, as difficult a situation as that creates for so many Americans.
Thank you. Do you think that Biden might consider moving the U.S. Embassy back to Tel Aviv?
No, he won't. And in fact, Biden himself has all but said that during the campaign. And while Biden will not be as unilateral a supporter of Israel as Trump has been, and as I believe we may have talked about before, my own suspicion, and I'm stealing this from the respected diplomat and analyst Aaron David Miller, who has written that Biden's approach to Israel will be much more like Bill Clinton's than Barack Obama's, which means somewhat more steadfast in his support of Israel, but probably not to the degree that Trump has been. Biden is going to face contentious issues with Israel on the Iran nuclear agreement and on questions of settlement expansion. I don't think he would see much of a benefit in moving the embassy back. He and Barack Obama 12 years ago said that they believed it should be moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, just like presidents of both parties did for many years before that. And even though they weren't willing to take the step then, any more than George Bush or Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan, I suspect that it is something that Biden thinks that now that it has happened, whatever repercussions might have taken place after the move didn't. And so better to move forward on other fronts rather than to revisit a not completely, but largely symbolic issue.
Thank you. Why can't a Biden administration simply reverse last-minute Trump sanctions against Iran and China, changes in election security and Defense Department senior leadership, and even troop reductions in Afghanistan pending a final negotiated agreement with the Taliban? And several people have been asking about the ability to reverse some of these policies and changes that Trump has made at the very end.
All of them are reversible, but most are very difficult to reverse in the immediate. In other words, for legal, for statutory, and for diplomatic reasons, it will take some time to reverse many of these actions. As far as troop withdrawals, the biggest obstacle is simply logistical. If you move thousands of servicemen and servicewomen out of Afghanistan or Iraq and bring them home, you certainly can send them back again, but it's a tremendous logistical undertaking. The other thing for Biden to consider is not just the logistical challenges of restoring that troop presence, but the political challenges as well. Biden, and we didn't talk about it much today, and it is something we'll discuss again in the weeks going forward. Biden, throughout the campaign, had somewhat of an uneasy armistice with the progressive wing of his own party. And as I mentioned earlier, they've issued some criticism, but not that loud, on his first appointments of White House staff. It was instructive that when Trump announced that he was lowering the troop presence in Iraq and Afghanistan, Trump received praise from many progressive Democrats. They criticized him for the way he was doing it. But there's a lot of people in the Democratic Party, there's a lot of people in America who do think that a smaller troop presence in those countries rather than a larger one is better. And so for Biden, not just the logistics of sending thousands of people, of servicemen and women back to those countries, but the politics of, upon taking office, increasing U.S. military presence in Afghanistan and Iraq creates a really tricky political equation with the base of his own party. It's not to say he wouldn't do it, but it's one more complication that reversing some of Trump's actions will present for him.
Thank you. Do you believe Trump will face criminal charges after he's out of office, as detailed in a New York Times article yesterday? If so, likelihood of pardon, conviction?
Well, this is one of the most difficult decisions that President Biden is going to have to make. And we asked a poll question on this last week, as some of you may remember. On one hand, as most of you said, in order to uphold the rule of law, many believe it is incumbent upon President Biden to allow his Justice Department to pursue criminal charges against Trump. On the other hand, there's any number of people in the country, not just Republicans, but a lot of respected Democrats, including many who have Biden's ear, who believe that if Biden is going to govern in some fashion of a bipartisan way, if he is going to try to reunify this country after such a long period of divisiveness, that overseeing legal prosecution against his predecessor is going to make that challenge much more difficult than it would be otherwise. So I don't know what the answer is, and that's something that President Biden will have to decide once he's taken office. What I will say, though, is that even if Biden and his attorney general decide not to go forward with pursuing legal actions against President Trump, it is an almost slam dunk certainty that local and state officials, primarily but not exclusively in New York, will continue to pursue legal actions that they've been investigating in those states. And so there's all sorts of legal questions about Trump's assessment of his properties, about the money that was paid to Stormy Daniels and to other women with whom he's been alleged to have relationships. And even if Biden decides not to move forward at the federal level, the state level legal proceedings are almost certain to continue. And it is worth noting before we go on to the next question, that while a president can pardon an individual of federal crimes, a president is powerless to pardon someone who's been convicted of local or state criminal behavior. There's a very serious constitutional question about whether Trump could pardon himself before leaving office or resign on the night of January 19th and have acting President Pence pardon him. But even if something like that were to take place, it would not affect in any way the local and state proceedings, which will continue after he leaves office no matter what.
Thank you. What do you think Biden's priorities on immigration and refugee policy should be, and what is realistic?
Well, Biden has made it clear that he's going to put a moratorium on all deportations. I believe for the first 100 days of his presidency. I'd have to check the time period on that to be sure, but he made that point very clear. He's also made it equally clear that he intends to pursue legal protections or to reinstate legal protections for the so-called dreamers, those young people who came here as children or even as infants with their parents, when their parents immigrated here without documentation years and years ago. So those are the two obvious ones. Although what's not clear on the question with dreamers is whether Biden will push for a pathway to citizenship for those young people, or simply just legal protections. So those are the two easiest, deportations and DACA. Beyond that, it's a little bit tougher to tell. It's a lot tougher to tell, because while Biden himself has indicated that he would like to pursue much more broad-based immigration reform, it's less clear whether the Senate remains in Republican hands or shifts to a very small Democratic majority, whether Biden would have the votes in order to implement large-scale reform efforts. It's very likely, I think it's almost certain, if not absolutely certain, that he will, by executive order, very quickly raise the levels of asylum and refugee admissions back to pre-Trump levels of those that we saw up until 2016. But the types of immigration reforms that have to be, that he believes, I think correctly, ought to be accomplished legislatively, is a much more uncertain path. My guess is you'll see Biden announce his support for very sweeping immigration reform packages, and then it will fall to him and his team and to Senator Schumer and to Speaker Pelosi to negotiate out significant steps forward, but perhaps not as sweeping as the original proposals that Biden himself is going to lay out.
Thank you. Regarding California elections, though he wasn't on the ballot, how does Governor Newsom's hypocritical dinner at the exclusive French Laundry, where there are no prices on the menu and Newsom didn't follow the dress code, place him in political peril? And does he really have a 60% approval rating?
Newsom had a 60% approval rating, at least before his dinner last week. On the off chance that there's anyone who's not familiar with this story, Governor Newsom last week had dinner at a very, very pricey restaurant in Napa Valley, celebrating the birthday of a friend of his who's a very powerful lobbyist in Sacramento, a man by the name of Jason Kinney, as well, ironically enough, as the leaders of the California Medical Association. It appears that dinner violated all sorts of social distancing and mask wearing norms. And while it's technically not in violation of the law, at least at that point, as the questioner made clear, there's an awful lot of people in the state of California who find Newsom's behavior very hypocritical. The fact that he would be telling Californians that they had to avoid that kind of activity while he was engaging in it himself. Newsom issued an apology, but this was a bad mistake on Newsom's part, and it will hurt him in a serious way going forward. My own assumption is that one of the main reason that Newsom's approval ratings have stayed so high over the last months is that while most voters are not thrilled with the shutdowns or some of the other orders that Newsom has made, they feel, and I'm obviously paraphrasing here for a broader popular sentiment, well, we don't love the way things are going given the pandemic, but he's doing the best he can. Might not be doing a great job, but he's not doing a horrible job. He didn't cause it. And in any case, say most deep blue Californians, it's Donald Trump who's really messing up this COVID situation, not Gavin Newsom. In other words, I think many Californians over the months have given Newsom the benefit of the doubt, acknowledging that he didn't cause it. And while his handling of it has been far from perfect, he's doing the best that he can. And while it's very difficult for political opponents to explain the separation of powers between the executive and the legislative branch in Sacramento, while it's very difficult for political opponents to explain why the employment department of California is having such a difficult time getting unemployment checks to Californians who've been out of work. Most of these are really difficult arguments to make, but the fact that the governor of California, while regularly telling Californians to stay home, is having dinner at a fancy restaurant with a powerful lobbyist while ignoring social distancing and mask wearing norms, that's a big problem. And while there's always speculation about Republican opposition to him in 2022 having a better opportunity than you would have expected a Republican opponent to have under normal circumstances, I think Newsom's bigger challenge is not necessarily from a Republican, but from another Democrat who realizes that voter unhappiness with such a stupid action is something that provides an opportunity for one of Newsom's opponents within his own party. So very serious impact, and I think it could hurt him considerably. I wouldn't go anywhere near predicting that it will cost him re-election. That's 2 years from now, but it damages Newsom much more than anything that he's done or said over the last 2 years.
Thank you. And this question actually spurned several questions from people about the California legislature, which is currently at a conference in Maui. Can you comment on that as well?
So the joke in Sacramento, as I understand it, is that Jason Kinney, the lobbyist whose birthday Governor Newsom was celebrating, it was Jason Kinney who leaked the story about the legislators going to Maui during a pandemic just to change the coverage. So to be fair, the entire legislature did not go to a retreat in Hawaii. Rather, a small number did. It looks like a dozen or less legislators attended that. And it's an annual conference. It's held by an organization called the California Independent Voter Project. And it's an opportunity for lobbyists and other policy specialists to interact with legislators of both parties under informal circumstances. The fact that the conference was held this year, the fact that even a much smaller number of legislators than normal attended has created a huge stir, not just in the media, but with voters, because voters see this as yet another example of the same type of double standard that we've just been talking about that related to Newsom. So I don't know what the outcome is going to be in terms of political impact on the legislature. Most people don't know who their assembly member is or who their state senator is, let alone become particularly motivated against them. But I suspect when these individuals are up for re-election, whether in 2 years or 4 years, this will be a key talking point for their opponents, no question about it. But much more important than the effect that it has on a small number, on a handful of legislators, in the California State Assembly and Senate, it will add to a much broader resentment of Californians toward their elected officials for saying one thing and doing another. And while the political impact is hard to predict, my biggest worry is it will make it much more difficult to enforce social distancing and mask wearing regulations in the weeks ahead when we're facing such an immense surge in the number of cases. If our elected officials no longer have the moral authority to call for the rest of us to make sacrifices, many of us will make those sacrifices because we know that they're in everyone's best interests. But those people who were resentful of those calls last spring and summer are going to be even more resentful and even less likely to cooperate now.
Yeah, it feels very let them eat cake. I don't like it. Was there any movement toward ending the Democratic supermajority in the California legislature? Why or why not?
Not really. While Republicans have picked up at least 2 seats in the House of Representatives in California and have the potential to pick up 2 more, it doesn't look like the legislative balance is going to change all that significantly one way or the other. The main reason for that is that, well, there's 2 main reasons for that. One, Californians, like voters in other states, tend to pay less attention to state legislators than they do to their members of Congress. And because state legislators tend to raise less money for their campaigns than congressional candidates, voters are therefore less aware of the candidates, either through the news media or through advertising, than they are when someone is running for Congress, which provides a pretty good advantage for incumbent legislators of both parties. And given the immense financial advantage that the majority Democratic Party has when it comes to funding legislative races, Republican candidates tend to be outfunded to a huge degree. And the lack of money plus the lack of public attention means that turning over those seats becomes much more difficult. Republicans did pick up a couple of seats that belonged to Democrats in swing districts, but they lost a couple of others that they had won barely 2 years ago. So on balance, the overall margins may change by a seat or 2, but not in any type of really impactful way.
Thank you. What do current polls show for the status of the senatorial races in Georgia? And will there be early voting, mail or in person, in the Georgia runoff elections?
So there will be early voting, and I have to admit I don't know the specifics of it in Georgia. My understanding is that the runoff rules will be the same as they were for the general election earlier this month in the fall, which means that mail voting and early voting will be available. The earliest polls out of Georgia show that in what we'll call the standard seat, the one that was up after 6 years, David Perdue's reelection campaign, it appears that Perdue and his opponent, John Ossoff, are almost deadlocked in the first public opinion polls. In the special election taking place because Kelly Loeffler was appointed to that seat by the governor after her predecessor stepped down, in that race, her challenger, Raphael Warnock, appears to have opened not a large lead, but a few point lead over Loeffler in early polling. The one other thing to keep in mind, and I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about Republicans' willingness or unwillingness to call out Trump, is a runoff election, like I said earlier, is almost completely based on which party can turn out its most loyal supporters. And so the real question in Georgia, and we'll see over the next several weeks how it plays out, is who's more excited? Is it Democrats having won the presidency who now see an opportunity to take the Senate as well? Or is it Republicans, in all likelihood in their minds, having lost the presidency, now seeing this as a last-ditch effort to hold on to at least one part of the government? Generally, people who are threatened are more motivated than people looking to gain, which should provide a slight advantage for the Republicans. But on the flip side, if the Democratic Party and its leaders are able to motivate their voters as effectively as they did in the presidential race, then there's while it's slightly uphill, it certainly would not be a major surprise if the Democrats were to win both of the seats. Loeffler is the more vulnerable of the two, but those are just early polls. And over the next several weeks, we'll keep you apprised on whether and how they change.
Okay, thank you. This will be my final question. Can you provide an overview of what elements/components are involved in a presidential transition? Which I know this could be a long answer, but maybe we can give an overview in the next couple of minutes.
Sure. There are a couple of things to keep in mind with the transition. One is simply logistical. And so I'll add it myself. There are actually three things to keep in mind. One is simply the logistics of putting people in the jobs and in the chairs and in the offices where the work of government is done. President of the United States has several thousand appointments that he or someday she will make to federal government. And it's been customary for the last couple of centuries that this is a period where the people who are about to depart those positions make room, again, just physically, for those who will be serving those roles in the future. With that logistical and geographic changeover is much more important is the intellectual handover. In other words, this is a several-week period in which outgoing appointed officials can brief their successors on the status of the various matters of policy that those successors will be taking on once the new president is sworn into office. In other words, you can be the world's biggest expert on infectious diseases, on national defense, on affordable health care, but if you don't know the state of play within the agency or department or office in which you're going to be working, you're at a huge disadvantage come January 20th. And while there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of civil servants who work in administrations, both Democrat and Republican, who are there to brief you, just as a human being, there's a certain learning curve of getting up to speed before you can be prepared to take on those issues. And it's been widely reported, including by the 9/11 Commission, that one of the reasons that our country was not as prepared as we could have been for the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, is because of the several-week delay after the 2000 election before the Bush transition could officially begin. Now, as we've talked about before, while outgoing President Clinton was making sure that Governor Bush, even before he was president-elect, was privy to national security briefings, there's still a whole ramping up process that wasn't available. And then third and finally is appointments. The president will appoint not just a White House staff and not just a cabinet, but hundreds and hundreds of sub-cabinet officers. And that process can't officially begin until the transition has started. So there's logistics, there's intellectual and policy capital, and there's appointments. And while the Biden transition seems to be doing as well a job as they can on those latter two items, obviously they're not able to progress nearly as much as they would like to and would be able to if the process were to become officially underway.
Thank you so much, Dan. I guess the upside is that he has been very close to that position before, so hopefully, he'll be able to ramp up a lot faster than many would.
Well, no question. The Trump campaign made light of his 47 years in federal government, but not only the president-elect, but the people around him, many of them have served in administrations before, either under Obama or Clinton, and so they'll come in with an advantage. But the particulars of day-to-day policy administration and priority still is a tremendous learning curve, even for the most experienced person. So hopefully that transition will be able to get underway officially sooner rather than later on one of the dates that we talked about in our survey question.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dan. I know Thanksgiving is coming up next week, and I know we've all been very grateful for you, and also really grateful to all of our audience and all of your great questions and your donations and support of us through all of this craziness. So I just want to wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving, and I hope you stay safe and call your family. They miss you.
And happy Thanksgiving to you and to Claire and to the whole team at LA World Affairs Council Town Hall. Also, Jessica, you guys do amazing work, and we're very grateful for all of you.
Thank you. Thanks.
And that goes for you too, Kim.
Thank you, Jessica, for your managing the questions. And Dan, thank you so very much for such an important discussion. For our viewers, if you're enjoying these programs, please text the name Schnur to the number on the screen. We're in the middle of our annual giving campaign, and we depend on your donations to cover our operations and the production of these live streams. So please give what you can. As I mentioned earlier, we've had an issue with our accessibility of our website. Our web hosting provider has experienced a malware attack, and through an abundance of caution, they have temporarily closed down their entire web hosting infrastructure, making our website inaccessible. So in the meantime, you can continue to register for our upcoming programs through the emails that you receive from us. Just click on the link. And if you have any questions whatsoever and need some answers, you can reach us at our office number, 424-258-6160. We have terrific programs for you after next week's holiday week, where we will be off. On December 1st, we have a U.S. Relations with Japan and Korea program. Dan will be back December 3rd with Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. We have a Young Professionals program focused on our international organizations becoming obsolete. We also have a very special wellness webinar with the Chicago School of Professional Psychology on the psychological impacts of the COVID. And on December 15th, California Congresswoman Karen Bass, who's on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, will be here. So please, everybody stay safe. The staff and I wish you a very enjoyable and safe holiday, and we do appreciate all your support and your contributions. Dan, thank you so much. We'll miss you next week. Back a week from Thursday. Thank you so much.